She walked through the school gates like a question mark no one dared to answer. Ms. Lena Johnson, long black trench coat, tight bun, and eyes that spoke of things books never taught. The morning sun hesitated on her shoulder as if unsure whether to shine on her or hide behind the clouds. She wasn't dressed like a typical teacher, too composed, too deliberate, and when her heels clicked against the linoleum floors of Roosevelt High, even the walls seemed to pause. Roosevelt was not the kind of school that welcomed new teachers with apple pies and open arms. It was a place of quiet wars, between students and silence, between rules and rebellion. Over the years, dozens of educators had come and gone, each carrying high ideals and leaving with broken resolve. The seniors joked that room 204, the history room, was cursed. And now Lena Johnson was walking straight into it. But Lena wasn't the kind to flinch. Not after growing up in the South Side, where sirens were lullabies and streetlights flickered like uncertain promises. She had learned to read people the way others read books, carefully, between the lines, with attention to silence more than words. What they didn't know, what none of them could have guessed, was that the woman walking through the hall had once faced down gang leaders with nothing but a glare, had buried her brother after a street fight, and had chosen to return to the very neighborhoods the city forgot, not to escape them, but to become the kind of presence she never had. When Lena entered room 204 for the first time, the students looked up, amused. Ethan, golden boy of arrogance, the self-appointed king of every social hierarchy, leaned back with a smirk that spelled this will be fun. Beside him sat Kyle, the quiet cruelty in human form, and Sean, who laughed not because he was mean, but because he was too weak to say no. Lena scanned the room, her gaze resting for a second longer on the quiet girl near the window, Sophia, fragile but not invisible, and then Malik, who carried rage like a second skin. She didn't smile.
She didn't need to.
"My name is Miss Johnson," she said, voice calm, deliberate, not soft. "You will not like me at first. Maybe not ever. That's not my job. My job is to teach you history. Real history. Not the kind that makes you feel good, but the kind that makes you want to be better." Silence. A pencil dropped. Someone coughed. And then she turned to the board, writing in bold strokes. Underground Railroad. Freedom beyond maps. Outside the window, a crow cawed once and took off. Inside room 204, something unfamiliar settled. Not fear. Not yet. Not respect either. It was attention. And that, in Roosevelt High, was already a revolution. She had arrived. From the place, no one dared to stand still. And whether they liked it or not, this classroom, these students, this building drenched in decades of defiance, would never be the same again. By the second week, the war had begun. They didn't throw punches. That would have been too honest. No, they chose subtler weapons. Whispered insults behind raised textbooks. Stolen markers. Phones held just low enough to avoid sightlines, but high enough to flash defiance. Lena Johnson wasn't surprised. She expected the resistance. In fact, she welcomed it. Real change, she knew, never arrived without friction. Ethan was the ringleader, as always. He'd sit at the back with his arms crossed, pretending to listen but offering sharp interruptions laced with sarcasm. "So, you're saying history's not about winners?" he scoffed one morning, as Lena recounted the story of the Haitian Revolution. "Sounds like someone's got a chip on her shoulder." She didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice. She simply looked at him, letting the silence fill the room like slow-moving smoke. "I'm saying history remembers what it's told to remember," she said quietly. "And people like you are used to being the ones who do the telling." That silenced even Kyle. For a moment. But they didn't stop. Malik arrived late every day, slamming the door hard enough to make the whiteboard tremble. Sean doodled guns on his desk, then smiled sweetly when she caught him. Sophia refused to speak at all. The entire classroom had become a stage, each student playing a carefully rehearsed role in the resistance. Still, Lena never cracked. She showed up every day, early, prepared, deliberate. Her chalkboard notes were crisp, her stories sharp, her expectations unwavering. She didn't punish late homework with rage or demand obedience with threats. She gave time. She gave space. She demanded dignity. Not for herself, but from them for themselves. And that unnerved them more than any screaming ever could. They tried to provoke her, to draw out the frustration they were so sure hid beneath her calm. And it was there, burning, glowing, begging for release. But Lena had walked through darker fires. She had waited at hospital beds, where time hung heavy like grief. She had once spent 6 months tutoring a young boy in juvie only to find out he was shot the night before his release. She knew what patience cost, and she had long since paid the price. She also knew it wasn't about winning the battle. It was about standing long enough for them to question why they kept fighting her. And slowly, quietly, the cracks began to show. One morning, she found her desk rearranged. They'd turned it upside down and balanced her chair on top, a silent message of mockery. Lena said nothing. She walked in, paused, then calmly took a deep breath, righted the desk, and sat down. Then she looked at the class and asked softly, "Why does power scare you so much when it doesn't belong to you?" No one answered. And later that week, when Malik arrived on time, just once, no one mentioned it, but everyone noticed. Sophia started to stay after class, fiddling with her pen like she wanted to speak, but didn't know how. Even Ethan, whose voice once filled the room with swagger, began listening longer before interrupting. It wasn't surrender. It wasn't transformation. It was erosion, slow, quiet, patient, and Lena Johnson understood erosion better than most. It never made noise, but it moved mountains. It was the third Monday of October when the storm finally broke. The hallway buzzed with rumors that someone had slipped a dead rat into Lena Johnson's drawer.
A dare, they said. A joke, they laughed.
It didn't matter who did it, though everyone suspected Kyle, with Ethan grinning behind the scenes and Sean tagging along like a shadow with no will of its own. They had convinced themselves that she was just another outsider trying to play savior. And like the others, she'd crack,
Scream. Cry.
walk away. But when Lena opened that drawer and met the beady eyes of something that had no business being there, she didn't flinch. She paused, reached into her coat pocket, pulled out a pair of latex gloves, the kind medics use, and gently removed the rat, wrapping it in an old newspaper like it was just another piece of trash. No yelling. No complaint. Just a quiet efficiency that unsettled everyone watching. Then she cleaned the drawer. Thoroughly. Silently. And when the students filed into room 204, expecting fury or a lecture, they found her already writing on the board. The dignity of the oppressed frightens those who've never earned their power. Unknown. That day, she didn't speak about history. She spoke about survival. About the time she was 16, surrounded by boys in a parking lot, and how silence became her shield. About her mother, who scrubbed floors in government buildings and was never once called by her name. About the strength it takes not to retaliate, but to endure with eyes open and spine straight. Every word landed like thunder. Ethan stared, unmoving, his usual smugness flickering beneath a confusion he didn't know how to hide. Kyle looked down for the first time that semester. Sophia's eyes welled, but she didn't wipe them. And Malik, leaned forward like he was hearing his own story told through someone else's mouth. Still, they didn't apologize. Not directly. Contempt doesn't melt overnight. It evaporates slowly under the heat of unshakable presence. A few days later, it rained hard. The city streets flooded, and buses were late. Lena arrived drenched, her coat clinging to her shoulders, hair plastered against her cheeks. She stood in front of the class, soaking, steam rising faintly from her skin. She didn't explain. She just wrote one word on the board: resilience. Then she taught. Wet, cold, unbothered. As if her soaked frame was just another page in the curriculum. That night, someone left a thermos of coffee on her desk. No note. But it wasn't a prank this time. The contempt had begun to fracture. Not from guilt, but from something deeper. Admiration they didn't yet have the language to confess. These kids, hardened by disappointment and systems that forgot them, were watching a woman who refused to yield to cruelty, who didn't demand respect but modeled it so relentlessly that their own scorn began to feel childish. The game stopped. Slowly. Kyle stopped smirking every time she passed by. Ethan began staying behind after class, pretending to argue a grade, but really just lingering in the safety of her stillness. Sophia raised her hand once, just once, and when she spoke, her voice didn't shake. Malik began arriving early, headphones off, eyes open. They never said they were sorry. But in a school like Roosevelt, respect didn't arrive with flowers. It arrived in quiet moments, in chairs pushed in after class, in hallways left unmarked, in questions that weren't meant to challenge, but to understand. Contempt is loud, but dignity, when it is worn like armor and offered without fear, is louder. And Lena Johnson? She had never needed to speak to silence a room.
She only had to stay.
It happened on a Wednesday, the kind of overcast morning that felt like something was holding its breath. The halls of Roosevelt High were quieter than usual, like even the building knew something was coming. Lena Johnson stood by the window, her coffee untouched, watching rain trace crooked lines across the glass. She had learned to read the tension in the air. And that day it was thick, waiting. It started with a scream. Not from room 204, from down the corridor. Metal clashing.
Shouting.
A scuffle. Then the unmistakable crash of a desk thrown, a sound that doesn't echo, it punches. Lena didn't hesitate. She moved with the purpose of someone who had seen this before. Not in schools, but in holding rooms. In homes where violence didn't knock. It let itself in. By the time she reached the hallway, 2 boys were tangled on the ground. Malik and a junior named Terrence. Both bleeding. Both shaking with something bigger than anger, the kind of fury born of years, not minutes. Teachers stood nearby, frozen by fear or protocol. Phones in hand, eyes wide. Useless. Lena didn't shout. She dropped to one knee beside them, her voice low but urgent. She didn't say stop. She said their names. Malik. Terrence. Look at me. Malik blinked first. Terrence hesitated. Lena put a hand on the floor, grounding herself in their chaos. You are not this moment. You are not what they expect of you. Don't give it to them. It wasn't a command. It was an offering of dignity, of choice, of a way out. And somehow it worked. They broke apart, breathing hard, rage retreating inch by inch like a tide pulled by something unseen. Security arrived late, storming in like cavalry in a story already changed. Malik was still cuffed. Terrence too. But they went quietly. And not once did Lena move away from them. She followed them out, a sentinel in soaked shoes, saying nothing, holding everything. Back in room 204, the silence was unnatural. Ethan sat stiff, his leg bouncing. Kyle stared at his phone. Sophia clenched her jaw, eyes darting between the door and her notebook. When Lena returned, her blouse stained with blood that wasn't hers, she didn't speak for a long moment. She simply stood in front of the board, looking at each of them like she saw past the masks they didn't know they still wore. Then she wrote, "Some battles aren't fought with fists. Some victories are survival." She turned to them, her voice barely above a whisper, but fierce in its steadiness. You all think this is just a school. A place to kill time until life chooses you. But this is the battlefield. Not of violence. Of identity. Of future. Every time you sit in that seat and choose to stay, to think, to ask, to not strike out, you are already winning. No one moved. Then Sophia raised her hand.
I was scared, she said. Just that.
But it cracked the room open. Ethan, for once, didn't try to lead. He just nodded.
Slowly.
Like something inside him had finally given way. Kyle whispered, "It could have been me. And it could have. Any of them." That's what Lena had always known. That the line between victim and perpetrator in places like Roosevelt was drawn in chalk. Easy to smear. Easy to forget. So that day, she threw away the lesson plan. She let them speak. She let them cry. She let them rage. They talked about fathers who disappeared, and mothers who worked 3 jobs, and teachers who gave up before they walked in. They cursed the system.
They cursed themselves.
They asked questions no one had dared to answer. And Lena listened. not to respond, but to carry. By the time the bell rang, no one moved. The classroom wasn't a classroom anymore. It had become a sanctuary, a scar, a revolution. It was the final battle, not because it was the loudest, but because after it, nothing went back to how it was. The contempt was gone. So was the distance. What was left was raw and fragile, but real. For the first time, Lena didn't have to teach. She just had to be there. And for once, that was enough. It began not with a lesson, but a question. A week had passed since the fight. Malik hadn't returned. Rumors flew: juvenile court, probation, expulsion. Lena Johnson knew better than to trust what floated in the halls. She also knew the silence around his absence was not just grief. It was guilt, unnamed, unspoken, but heavy in the air like smoke after a fire. She walked in that Monday morning with no books in her hands. No slides. No binder. Just a box. She placed it on her desk without a word. The class watched. Suspicious. Curious. Waiting for the other shoe to drop. She looked at them, one by one, then spoke in a voice low but impossible to ignore. This is not a lesson. This is a reckoning. She opened the box and pulled out a stack of folded papers.
Worn.
Yellowed at the edges. Some torn. Some damp with time. Letters. Photographs. Newspaper clippings. She spread them across the table like sacred objects. And then she told them the truth. Not about Malik. Not about Roosevelt. But about herself. She told them about East Baltimore. About sirens at night and school hallways that smelled like bleach and despair. About a teacher who called her girl instead of her name. About her brother Marcus, a genius who died on a sidewalk while holding a library book. She told them how grief could masquerade as ambition. How she once tried to run from her past so fast she forgot her own reflection. And how, one day, in a courtroom where a 14-year-old boy was being sentenced for a crime she knew he didn't commit because she'd seen the same lie told about her brother, she decided she couldn't stay silent anymore. So I walked away, she said, from a career, a salary, a safe life. And I came here because I was tired of watching people who look like me get swallowed by a system that feeds on silence. The room was still, not with confusion, but recognition. Because the kids in room 204 knew all too well what silence costs. Ethan leaned forward, his voice barely a breath. Was it worth it? Lena looked him in the eyes that had once narrowed in defiance, but now trembled under the weight of his own searching. I don't know yet, she said. That's the truth. But every time one of you starts to see yourselves beyond what this city tells you, it starts to feel like maybe it will be. That day, the classroom changed. They didn't read from textbooks. They read from themselves. Kyle spoke first, about the night his uncle was arrested in front of him, and how he still dreamed of red and blue lights. Sophia brought in a poem she'd written in secret about her mother's hands, cracked, brown, beautiful, tired. Ethan, still hiding behind sarcasm like a shield, confessed he hadn't seen his father in 6 years, and it was easier to act like he didn't care than to admit he couldn't stop caring. They weren't just students anymore. They were witnesses. And Lena? She wasn't just a teacher. She had become a mirror, a safe house, a catalyst. Each day, she brought in more artifacts from the lives of people long forgotten, prison letters from civil rights organizers, arrest records of women who refused to sit at the back of buses, court transcripts where justice had a name but not a voice. She asked them not to memorize, but to feel, not to analyze, but to ask, what kind of truth gets buried? And who decides which truth survives? They made posters. They wrote letters. They created timelines of silence, charting every moment someone had told them to be smaller, quieter, invisible. Then they made a second timeline of the first time they said no. Room 204 became something no one had planned, a spark. Other students started visiting during lunch. Teachers came by and left with more questions than answers. The principal warned Lena to stay within curriculum, but even she couldn't ignore the shift. The way truancy dropped, the way hall fights stopped, the way the same kids once labeled at risk now stayed after school, reading Baldwin and Morrison like gospel. The classroom had become sacred. Not because Lena had control, but because she had given it back to them. And they, in turn, began to tell the truth. Not just about racism, poverty, violence, but about hope, about dreams, about who they could be if the world stopped lying to them. By the time Malik returned, thinner, quieter, but still standing, they had saved him a seat. He didn't speak for a full day, just sat, listened. Then he raised his hand, and the room exhaled. The truth had arrived, and no one in that classroom would ever be the same. It didn't happen with fanfare. There were no morning announcements, no special assemblies, no applause. Legacies built on courage rarely arrive with celebration. They arrive quietly, in the shadows of choices that most people never see, in the steady echo of someone who refused to look away. Lena Johnson walked into room 204 on her last day like she had on her first. No makeup, no armor, no promises. Just truth. They had found out only days earlier. Her contract wouldn't be renewed. Not a good fit, the memo said. Disruptive methods. A parent had complained about radical material. Another said their child was asking dangerous questions. Lena had read it all without flinching. Because something in her had changed, or maybe something long buried had finally surfaced. And in its place stood a woman who no longer feared being misunderstood, only being forgettable. That morning, her desk was covered with notes. Folded scraps of paper. Drawings. A poem written in uneven cursive that simply read, "You saw me before I did. Thank you for that." She didn't cry. She just stood a little taller. The students were already in their seats, waiting. This time, no one slouched. No one looked away. The room held something sacred now, not discipline, not fear, but reverence. She looked around. These faces, once restless, now resolute. Ethan, who no longer mocked himself before others could. Sophia, who was applying to Howard University with a personal essay titled "The Revolution Began" in room 204. Kyle, who'd stopped skipping class and started mentoring freshmen in the library after school. Malik, who returned not broken, but burning, quieter, yes, but with a new fire in his questions. Who now walked the hallways not like a threat, but like someone who knew his own weight. "You don't need me anymore," Lena said softly, almost more to herself than to them. But they shook their heads. "Yes, we do." She smiled, not the kind that hides pain, but the kind that holds pride. "No, you need each other now. And you know how to build something real. Something that lives even when people try to tear it down." She stepped aside and pointed to the walls, covered now in handwritten declarations, student art, historical timelines intertwined with personal truths. A living museum of resistance and rebirth. "This isn't mine. This is yours." And then, she did what no one expected. She passed around an envelope, thick, sealed, addressed to the next teacher in room 204. Inside, she explained, were letters. From each of them. To someone they hadn't met yet. Someone who might one day sit where they sat, feel what they felt. Someone the world would try to break in the same old ways. "Courage," she said, "isn't something you own. It's something you lend. Over and over. Until the world learns." Then she walked out. No ceremony. No goodbye speech. But what she left behind was louder than any farewell, a blueprint. In the weeks that followed, strange things happened. Students stopped whispering their thoughts and started writing op-eds for the school paper. Sophia organized a mural project, titled "This Is Ours," featuring portraits of Black educators, community elders, and protesters with raised fists. Kyle started a podcast called "Truth from the Back of the Room," where students interviewed janitors, cafeteria workers, and retired teachers, people whose names weren't on buildings but whose stories built them. Even the principal, once wary, found herself quoting Baldwin in staff meetings. But the most remarkable change came not in programs or posters, it came in how they looked at each other. They no longer avoided eye contact. They no longer apologized for being brilliant. They no longer waited to be given power. They claimed it, one word at a time. Years later, room 204 would still be different. Teachers rotated. Administrators came and went. The paint chipped. Desks changed, but the heartbeat never faded. Because somewhere between the silence and the spark, Lena Johnson had taught them the most radical lesson of all. That courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to speak, even when the world prefers your silence. And that legacy? It wasn't her name. It was their voices. Still rising. Still echoing. Still rewriting what it means to be seen.